Tip number one, understand that the recall is a trained behavior. And what I mean by this, I think a lot of owners get confused in thinking that their dog is just always being stubborn because their dog comes to them sometimes. But that just because your dog comes to you at times doesn't mean that they are trained to do it in a lot of different situations and a lot of different environments. That's something that you, in order to get a good, reliable recall, you have to spend time not only training what you want the dog to do, but then you have to practice in a lot of different situations. And that leads me right to tip number two. Tip number two, pick a very specific cue, command, signal, whatever you want to call it, but it should mean that you want your dog to instantly return to you. A lot of owners that I work with, when I ask them to call the dog, they usually use something like Enzo, come here, Kona, come here, and it's somewhat kind of informal. So when you are training the command, I want you to pick something very specific to your dog. It's going to help you get in the right mindset in understanding what you are trying to accomplish, and it's going to be easier for your dog to understand what you want them to do. So for instance, I use either often a whistle or the word come, but I say it in a very distinct way. So I may say something like, come! Good. Okay. Tip number three, set your dog up for success. What I mean by this is when you're first starting to train in the recall, don't practice in situations where you're not able to make the dog follow up on the command. So when I'm first practicing, especially in a large field like this, I'm going to put the dog on either a 6-foot leash, or here I have a 30-foot long line. This way, if the dog ignores me, I'm going to be able to make her come to me, because I don't want her to learn that she can just continually ignore my recall command. So I would just walk her around. Nina, come! Good girl. Good. Feed, and let her go back to doing whatever she was doing beforehand. But this way, if she didn't respond, I could give a little pull on that line and get her moving to me. Tip number four, use something of really high value to the dog when you are practicing your recall. So if I'm working on obedience inside the house, such as sit or stay or something like that, I may be using the dog's kibble. But when I'm training the recall, I want to use something that the dog really enjoys, because I'm often competing with a lot of very enticing things out in the environment. So every dog's going to be different. Nina, come! So you want to find what your dog really likes. With this dog here, I'm just using a little bit of string cheese. Good. Okay, go play. But you may experiment with your own dog. If your dog has a lot of prey drive, then you could be using a tug toy. You could even be rewarding with a ball. You could be rewarding with some type of meat, such as deli meat or liver treats or whatever it may be. But hopefully you get my point. But don't just be using something of really low value, such as kibble, when you're working with your recall. Tip number five, don't let your dog ignore the recall command. Right? This is something that's really important. So I see a lot of times owners call the dog and then the dog blows them off, and they just sit there and keep calling the dog. Well, the dog starts to learn that the command is irrelevant. There's no consequence to it. So it's really important that you're able to follow up once you call your dog. Tip number six, don't punish the dog when they finally give you what you wanted. An example of this would be a dog playing keep away. So maybe the dog gets out the front door, starts going on their own personal adventure, and then you are calling the dog, you're upset, the dog continues to evade you, and then you finally get the dog, and then you yell at them. Well, from the dog's perspective, it just got worse for them. So as hard as that may be to not unleash all of those emotions on your dog, it's going to be really important, because you're just going backwards in your training. It's just going to make your dog want to play keep away for a longer period of time in the future. So if your dog gets out, say, of the front door and is running around the neighborhood, when you catch them, ideally you make it somewhat at least neutral, or even positive. So you could leash your dog and take them on a 3 or 4 or 5 minute walk, and then take them back inside, rather than yelling at the dog, grabbing them and pulling them inside. Tip number 7, Don't bribe your dog, reinforce. A lot of owners have difficulty with understanding the difference here. If you find yourself saying things like, do you want a treat or do you want a cookie, then you're probably bribing. So an example would be the dog's in the backyard, you call the dog ignores you or blows you off, and then you go inside and grab the treat bag and ask them if they want a treat. Well, the dog is learning to just kind of hold off to see what you're going to do next. And so they learn that if they hold off on the recall, they're going to see if you're going to go and then begin to bribe them. So you want to really make sure that you want to stay away from that kind of training technique, if you could call it that. Tip number 8, do not continuously call your dog to unwanted events or situations. So I see this mistake occur often, and what I mean by this is, let me give you a few examples. So maybe your dog is having a good time playing out in the backyard. You call your dog and then you instantly take them inside and then you crate them. All right, so in that situation, the dog learns that when you call them, something unwanted is going to happen from the dog's perspective. Another example would be a classic example of dogs playing around at the dog park. You call the dog to you, you leash the dog and you go home. Well, it won't take but a few times until your dog starts to learn that when you call them, that is going to end all of their fun. So for example, this dog here, she's been out for a little while out here in my play yard, and I'm getting ready to have to kennel her for a few hours. And so what I would do here, Leia, come. I'm gonna call her over to me. Good girl. I'm gonna feed her. Good girl. Put this little slip lead, now I can control her. And now what I would probably do is just walk her around the yard for 3 to 5 minutes, and then I would just take her into the kennel rather than calling her straight to me and then immediately going into the kennel, okay? Because if I do it that way, it won't be long she's going to learn that when I call her, she may be kenneled, and that's not something, she doesn't mind the kennel too much, but it's not something that she would prefer when compared to being out here roaming around in the yard. All right, so it's really important when you are going to call your dog, think about how your dog perceives the situation from their own point of view. Good girl, yeah. Tip number 9, practice check-ins often. And what I mean by this is when your dog's out playing, you want to be calling your dog periodically, rewarding them, and then letting them go back to play. So for instance, let's see these dogs, if I can get them out playing. So while these dogs are running around out here, I'm going to just be periodically calling them, rewarding them, and letting them go back to play. Okay, go play. Tip number 10, you have to maintain the behavior. And what I mean by this is that when you're training the recall, it's not something that you do once and then you're done with it. You're going to have to continue to practice and continue to provide reinforcement to the dog. Behavior is always in flux, so it's really important that you don't get into this mindset that I'm going to spend 2 or 3 weeks training it and then I don't have to do anything else. All right, so for instance, Sonny, come. So with one of my personal dogs here, Sonny, I can call him and he can come. It doesn't mean that I have to feed him every single time he calls me at this point. All right, he knows what I want and he's expecting something may happen that's good for him, but that doesn't mean I have to feed him every single time. Okay, go play. But maybe the next time I call him, I may feed him, I may not. It may be the 3rd time I call him that I feed him. So I always make sure that I do continue to provide reinforcement throughout the dog's life.